The morning after my 18th birthday, I was rinsing a coffee mug in the small kitchen sink when I heard tires on gravel. Not fast, not angry, just steady, like someone who already knew where they were going. Outside, the air was still cold from the night. The lake behind the cabin had that thin silver look it gets just before the sun fully clears the trees. A few paper plates from the party were stacked on the counter, and the faint smell of smoke from the fire pit clung to my hoodie. I dried my hands on a dish towel and looked through the front window. A moving truck rolled up the drive. Behind it came my father's large sport utility vehicle and then my younger brother's car. I didn't feel surprised. My father stepped out, waving a thick manila envelope. "This place belongs to our family now, daughter," he called out. "The probate court has recognized our filing, and we are moving in to claim the primary residents as the rightful heirs." Have you ever felt like the invisible one in your own family? I would love to hear your thoughts down in the comments. Drop a note and let me know where you are listening from and what time it is for you right now. I would love to know who is part of our community. My father's voice was the loudest thing in the driveway, sharp and filled with a confidence he hadn't earned. He looked at the hand-built colonial mansion like it was a pile of cash he was finally allowed to spend. Jackson, my younger brother, was already halfway to the front door, his eyes darting toward the second floor, probably picking out which balcony he'd use for his next social media post. They were acting like tourists who had just been handed the keys to the city. My father waved that thick manila envelope again. "Pack your things, Brianna. We will need you out by sunset. The movers have a long day ahead of them." I didn't cry. I didn't even set down the coffee mug. Anger wasn't loud this time, it was clinical. I had been the silent investor in their version of family for 18 years, footing the emotional bill while they overran their credit limits. But my compassion was a luxury. They had officially overdrafted. I walked out onto the wide Charleston piazza, the white wood cool under my bare feet. I didn't look at my father. I looked at the dark sedan parked in the shade of the ancient oaks near the gate. "Marcus," I said, my voice cutting through Gary's instructions to the moving crew. A man in a tailored charcoal suit stepped out of the car. Beside him, a county deputy. The movers stopped. The ramp of the truck stayed half lowered, a mechanical stall that mirrored the look on my father's face. "What is this?" Gary asked, his smile finally beginning to look like a liability. He stepped toward the porch, tapping the envelope against his leg. "I told you we have the documents. The inheritance is sorted." I didn't ask to see them. I already knew what was in there: forgeries, shortcuts, and the desperate hopes of a failed developer. I leaned against the railing and looked down at him. "You are late, Gary. By exactly 12 hours and 5 minutes. Marcus stepped forward, holding a crisp, leather-bound folder. He didn't rush. He spoke with the kind of calm you only get when the law is a fortress behind you. "Mr. Bennett, I represent the Eleanor Hale Irrevocable Trust. Per the automatic distribution trigger set by your parents, the transition of power was self-executing at 12:01 a.m. Today, she is the sole trustee. Furthermore, Mr. Bennett, we have already recorded the deed transfer with the county. We are here with a civil standby order to ensure my client's quiet enjoyment of her property." The deputy isn't here to mediate. He is here to oversee the immediate removal of unauthorized persons from a private estate. The silence that followed was expensive. I watched my father's face drain of color, the smugness evaporating into raw panic. He looked at the envelope in his hand like it had just caught fire. Angela, my mother, stepped out of the vehicle, her eyes wide as she looked from me to the deputy. "I didn't call anyone this morning," I said, my tone as flat as a balance sheet. "I planned ahead. Any attempt to remove furniture or enter this house is now officially trespassing." This isn't a family dispute anymore. It is a procedural reality. Deputy? The officer stepped forward, his hands resting near his belt. Sir, we are going to need you to instruct the crew to pack up and leave the property immediately. I remember the weight of the envelope that arrived at our house in Chattanooga when I was 14. It was thick, ivory paper that felt heavier than a mere letter, a full-ride scholarship to the most prestigious architectural preparatory academy in the state. I walked into the kitchen, my heart racing with the kind of hope that only a child who hasn't been disappointed yet can carry. My mother, Angela, was leaning against the counter, her phone wedged between her shoulder and ear, while she scribbled a grocery list. I stood there, waiting for a gap in her conversation. When I finally whispered that I'd won the full scholarship, she didn't even hang up the phone. She glanced at the gold-crested letterhead, gave me a quick, practiced smile that didn't reach her eyes, and said, "That is nice, sweetie," before immediately telling the person on the other end that Jackson needed new cleats for his junior varsity football game. 10 minutes later, the house was in a state of high alert emergency. It wasn't because of my academic success. It was because Jackson had been suspended for a scuffle on the practice field. My parents were calling the principal, hiring a private tutor so he wouldn't fall behind, and Angela was baking a batch of double chocolate cookies for his teammates to show the family's support. My scholarship letter sat on the counter, eventually getting stained by a ring of spilled milk Jackson left behind as he stomped to his room. This was the fundamental algorithm of my childhood. My achievements were treated as default settings, while Jackson's failures were national tragedies that required every ounce of the family's bandwidth. I realized then that I wasn't a daughter to them. I was a self-maintaining asset. They didn't have to worry about me, so they didn't bother to notice me. My silence during those years wasn't a sign of weakness or submission. It was a strategic survival tactic, a visible chain of the survivor. I learned to build my life in the shadows because the sunlight in that house was only reserved for Jackson's fires. I lived in a house without bars, but the iron cage of being the glass child invisible and yet expected to hold up the ceiling was there all the same. If I didn't demand attention, I could develop my own plans without them being audited or sold off to pay for Jackson's next expensive mistake. That night, I opened the letter alone at my desk. I read it 3 times, memorizing the words that proved I was capable of winning without their permission. I bought a cheap frame from a craft store and hung it on my wall. I wasn't looking for an audience. I was creating a physical receipt of my own existence, so I would not gaslight myself later into thinking my merit was just a dream. My grandparents, Eleanor and Warren, were the only ones who saw through the quiet. They recognized that while my parents were busy managing Jackson's chaos, I was quietly architecting a future that had nothing to do with their approval. They knew that a $15 million legacy could not be left in the hands of people who treat success as a footnote and greed as a family value. That is why I am standing on this porch today. The debt of honor was settled years ago. Now, I am just the one calling in the audit. Gary's face went from pale to a deep, bruised purple. The manila envelope in his hand crumpled as his grip tightened, a physical manifestation of his authority slipping through his fingers. He didn't look like a father anymore. He looked like a landlord who had just been served an eviction notice from his own tenant. "You are clearly not in your right mind, Brianna," he shouted, his voice echoing off the columns of the piazza. "Look at you. You are barely 18, and you are standing here with a lawyer and a badge, like you are some kind of high-stakes player. This is a mental breakdown, and we are not going to let you destroy your future or ours." Angela moved toward the porch steps, her hands clasped in front of her in a gesture that was supposed to look like a plea but felt like a demand. "We have done everything for you," she said, her voice shaking with a practiced kind of sorrow. We struggled to raise you. We were just trying to protect you from the burden of this place. You are being so heartless, so ungrateful. Don't you care about family loyalty?" I watched them, and for the first time, the architecture of their manipulation was visible to me. It was clinical. They were caught in the trap of normalizing cruelty. This is the psychological blueprint of a toxic family. They normalize the exploitation of the responsible child to subsidize the failures of everyone else. Because I was the one who never missed a deadline, the one who worked 3 jobs throughout high school to fund my own future while Jackson chased dreams he couldn't afford, they decided my silence was consent. In their eyes, I wasn't an individual with legal rights. I was a high-yield savings account. They were entitled to withdraw from whenever Jackson's football career or Gary's failed developments hit another red line. They weren't angry that I was standing up for myself. They were angry that the resource they had managed for years had suddenly developed its own security system. Jackson didn't even look at me. He was too busy looking at the property. "I am taking the room on the 2nd floor with the balcony," he said, his voice loud and entitled, ignoring the deputy entirely. "It has the best view for my stream. Mom, tell the movers to start with the gaming desk." The audacity was a different kind of sunrise, the kind that makes everything too bright to ignore. Gary stepped onto the first stair, his eyes narrowed. "I have already made calls, Brianna. We are filing for emergency guardianship this afternoon. You are behaving erratically, and you are clearly unstable. I won't let you throw away $3 million of family liquid assets because you want to play adult. I am your father, and my word still carries weight here." He really believed it. He thought that if he said the lie loud enough, the law would bend to his will. But Gary was still reading from an old script, and I had already rewritten the ending. I didn't answer him. I didn't defend my mental health or my character. I simply looked at Marcus, who was already opening the next file in his folder. We weren't debating feelings anymore. We were preparing to deliver the lethal discovery. Marcus stepped off the porch and walked into the center of the driveway, his shoes crunching on the gravel with a rhythm that felt like a countdown. He ignored Gary's shouting and instead pulled a single plastic-sleeved page from his folder. "Mr. Bennett, I have the direct verification from the county recorder's office. The notary stamp on your documents belongs to a commission that does not exist in this state. The credentials listed are fraudulent. In this jurisdiction, criminal impersonation of a notary and the uttering of a forged instrument are Class D felonies. We have already flagged these documents with the district attorney's fraud unit." My father's mouth snapped shut. I watched the realization hit him. The shortcut he'd taken to save his failing development career had just become a criminal liability. He had tried to use a fake key to open a $15 million lock, and now the alarm was screaming. Marcus did not stop. He pulled out another set of papers, these ones bearing a bold court seal. "This is a temporary restraining order signed and filed this morning. It prohibits you, Angela and Jackson, from coming within 500 feet of this property or the trustee." Angela gasped, her hand flying to her throat as if she could physically hold back the fallout. "You are treating us like criminals, Brianna. Your own parents." I didn't blink. "I am treating the situation with the precision it requires. You arrived with a moving truck to seize an estate you do not own. That is a legal definition, not a personal one." The deputy stepped toward the movers, who were already backing away from the truck. "Gentlemen, return the items to the house and close the ramp. Now." The crew didn't hesitate. They moved with a speed Gary could never command, unloading the grandmother's antique dining chairs as if they were made of glass. "This isn't just about property, Gary," Marcus added, his voice low and lethal. "We have flagged the file with the county. Any future attempts to cloud this parcel with unauthorized instruments will result in immediate referral for investigation. We are not negotiating. We are enforcing." Jackson looked at the gaming desk being slid back onto the piazza, his eyes welling with the kind of bratty frustration he used when he lost a football game. He looked at me, waiting for the apology I had given him 1,000 times before. I didn't offer it. I offered him a view of the exit. "The movers are done," the deputy said, pointing toward the vehicle. "It is time for you all to vacate the premises. If you are still on this property in 5 minutes, I will be forced to place you under arrest for criminal trespass." Gary tried to say my name one last time, a final attempt to use the parental gaslight, but I simply turned my back and looked at the salt marsh. The fog was lifting, revealing the sharp, clean lines of the estate I had spent my life protecting in silence. My father was no longer a threat, he was just a noisy distraction in the rearview mirror. I walked back into the hallway, my bare feet silent on the floorboards that my grandfather had hand-laid 40 years ago. I entered my grandfather's private study, moved the heavy oak desk, and accessed the biometric floor safe he had installed just weeks before he passed. It was scuffed and utilitarian, a box that didn't care about aesthetics, only the security of what was inside. I carried it to the oak table where Marcus was already setting up his laptop. This was the lethal discovery. This was the moment the family drama turned into a criminal case. I opened the lid and pulled out a single thumb drive. Marcus plugged it in, and the screen glowed with the faces of Eleanor and Warren Hale. They looked smaller than I remembered, sitting in their high-backed chairs 48 hours before they passed. My grandmother spoke first, her voice steady but thin, like worn silk. "Gary," she said, looking directly into the lens. "If you are watching this, it means you have ignored our final warnings. It means you could not wait for the grass to grow over our graves before you tried to seize what was never yours." My father, still standing near the door as the deputy watched him, went entirely still. The video was a ghost speaking truth from a digital grave. Eleanor explained the silent regret of the watcher. She and Warren had spent decades observing the vulture behavior Gary tried to hide. They saw him trying to secretly negotiate the sale of the marshlands 10 years ago. They knew about the unauthorized loans he tried to take out against their estate while they were still breathing. "We stayed quiet because we were caught in the crossfire of our own hope," my grandfather added, his eyes sharp even through the pixels. "We wanted to believe our son was a man of character, but we realized hope is not a strategy for protection. We could not confront you directly without destroying the only version of family Brianna had left. So, we chose to watch, and we chose to document." This silent regret filled the gap in my heart. They hadn't been passive, they had been protective. They were caught between the hope of a parent and the reality of a vulture, and the diagnosis of their illness was simply the final deadline that forced them to build this trap. The screen shifted to a document, the same backdated agreement Gary had tried to use this morning. My grandfather explained that they had never signed it. Marcus tapped a key on his laptop, bringing up a separate window filled with lines of code. "We tracked the metadata on the file you tried to file electronically last week," Marcus said, his voice as cold as a frozen lake. "The device fingerprint leads directly back to your personal laptop. The Internet Protocol logs show the upload happened from your home office on Tuesday at 3:15 in the afternoon. You didn't just forge a signature, Gary. You created a digital audit trail that leads straight to a felony charge." This was the kill shot. I didn't feel the need to shout. I just watched my father realize that the paper trail he'd tried to forge was actually a digital noose. The grandparents hadn't just left me an inheritance. They had left me a fortress equipped with a legal firing squad. I closed the lockbox. The audit was complete, and the final balance was 0. Gary's shoulders didn't just drop, they collapsed. The arrogant developer who had stomped onto my porch an hour ago was gone, replaced by a man who looked like he'd been hollowed out from the inside. His hands, which had been waving forged documents with such confidence, were now shoved deep into his pockets, trembling. Brianna, please, he rasped, his voice cracking like dry wood. I am in over my head. The development in North Charleston. It is underwater. I owe people, Brianna. Dangerous people. The North Charleston project didn't just fail. It was a Ponzi-style shell game. I'm facing a margin call I can't cover, and the private lenders I leveraged are done waiting. If I don't have that $3 million by Friday, my entire firm collapses into a criminal investigation. I didn't blink. I didn't offer a chair or a glass of water. I watched him like an architect inspecting a structural failure with interest, but no emotion. He was finally being honest, but only because his lies had run out of credit. He needed my $3 million to pay for his own arrogance. He wanted to trade my future for his past mistakes. Angela stepped toward me, her face a mask of blotchy red skin and wet eyes. How can you do this, Brianna? After everything? We are your parents. We are your own blood. She weaponized the word blood as if it were a legal contract that allowed them to bleed me dry. Blood is not a valid notary stamp, Angela, I said, my voice ice, cold, and precise. You didn't see me as blood when you were ignoring my scholarship to bake cookies for Jackson's football scuffles. You saw me as an asset. A safe, invisible resource you could harvest whenever you hit a red line. But I have closed the account. I reached into Marcus's folder and pulled out the formal trespass notice. I didn't hand it to them. I placed it on the small table between us, a physical barrier of white paper and black ink. You are no longer welcome here, I said. If you set foot on this gravel again, the deputy won't be here to ask questions. He will be here to make an arrest. Gary looked at the paper, then at the camera where his parents' ghosts were still staring him down. He knew he had lost. He had spent 18 years underestimating the daughter who watched and planned in the shadows, and now he was standing in the chasm of his own making. They filed out of the house like a funeral procession for their own greed. Jackson was already in the vehicle, his face pressed against the glass, looking not with anger, but with a bewildered kind of shock that his golden child status didn't work on the law. Angela followed, her head down. Gary was the last, his footsteps heavy and uneven on the gravel. I stood on the piazza and watched them leave. I watched the vehicle back out, the tires crunching frantically, this time a sharp contrast to the steady, arrogant arrival of the morning. When the gates finally swung shut, the silence that rushed back in was absolute. I walked back into the foyer and gripped the heavy oak handle of the front door. I pulled it shut and turned the key to the new brass deadbolt. The click was short, sharp, and final, the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of a legacy being locked and a life finally being my own. The silence that settled over the estate wasn't the heavy, suffocating kind I had grown up with in Chattanooga. It was the quiet of a house that had finally been cleaned. I spent the first few weeks walking the salt marsh at dawn, watching the light hit the water, and realizing that for the first time in 18 years, I wasn't waiting for a fire to start. I wasn't bracing for the next emergency or another demand. I was just an architect standing on a foundation that was finally solid. I didn't spend the $3 million on a new car or a vacation. Instead, I sat down with Marcus and drafted the charter for the Eleanor Hale Endowment Fund. It is a multi-million-dollar scholarship program dedicated to the kids. It is a foundation dedicated to the kids who are expected to be perfect, so their siblings can afford to be chaotic. The ones who frame their own scholarships alone at night. I wanted to turn this $15 million fortress into a sanctuary for those who have spent their lives being the silent investors in someone else's drama. This is the justice of the sower. Revenge is a reaction to the past. It is about pulling weeds and staring at the dirt where things used to be. But justice is about the future. It is about taking the resources that were meant to be stolen am planting something that will outlast the anger. By establishing this foundation, I have made the greed of my parents irrelevant. Their attempt to seize this house didn't end in a demolition, it ended in a construction. I have come to realize that some people will never see your worth until you make it illegal for them to ignore it. If you find yourself in a similar situation, remember that setting a boundary isn't a betrayal of your family, it is an act of loyalty to yourself. You don't have to stay small just because the people who raised you are afraid of how much space you can take up. Forgiveness isn't always about a hug and a tearful reconciliation. Sometimes, the only way to set yourself free is to realize that blood is not a valid notary stamp. It doesn't give anyone a permanent lien on your peace or a lifelong subscription to your resources. My grandparents knew that. They didn't leave me a prize, they left me a responsibility. And today, as I look out over the marsh, I know the audit is finally closed. I am the trustee of a new legacy, one built on merit, protected by process, and defined by the quiet strength of knowing I am enough. If this story gave you the strength to stand your ground, share it with someone who needs to hear that their boundaries are valid. Subscribe for more stories of justice served.